In the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, in the year 1884, there lived a man the townsfolk called the Mountain Ghost. His real name was Cade Thornwood, and he stood 8 feet tall in his worn leather boots. His shoulders were broad enough to block a doorway. His hands were large enough to palm a man's head like a melon. But those who knew him understood that beneath all that imposing muscle beat the heart of a gentle giant. Cade was Cherokee on his mother's side, white on his father's. His thick black hair hung past his shoulders, usually tied back with leather cord. His beard was full and dark, streaked with the first hints of silver, though he was only 32. His arms were thick with muscle from years of chopping wood and hauling timber. His chest was barrel-shaped from a lifetime of mountain living. He moved through the forest with surprising grace for such a large man, his moccasins making barely a sound on the forest floor. He lived alone in a cabin high up in the mountains, 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking the valley below, where the small town of Pine Hollow nestled among the trees. Smoke from 50 chimneys rose into the autumn air. The town held perhaps 300 souls, most of them miners or farmers scratching out a living from the stubborn mountain soil. Cade had been 10 years old when his mother told him the truth about his father. The man had taken one look at his oversized infant son and decided he wanted no part of raising what he called a half-breed freak. It was a wound that had never fully healed, though Cade had learned to carry it quietly. He had spent his childhood watching other boys with their fathers, learning to fish and hunt and work the land together. He had learned those skills on his own, through trial and error, with only his mother's encouragement to guide him. His mother, Ruby Thornwood, had been a small woman with a fierce spirit, barely reaching her son's chest even when he was 15. She had worked herself to the bone, keeping their small plot of land productive after her husband left. She had raised Cade to be respectful, hard-working, and kind. When she died of pneumonia 5 winters ago, she had made him promise to find someone to share his life with. "You have too much love in you to waste it on just the animals," she had whispered with her last breath. "Promise me you will try to find a good woman who can see past that mountain of muscle to the gentle soul underneath." Cade had promised, but keeping that promise had proven more difficult than breaking wild horses. Most women in Pine Hollow were either already married, too young, or frankly intimidated by his size. The few who had shown interest seemed more fascinated by his unusual stature than genuinely attracted to him as a person. At 32, he had resigned himself to bachelorhood. He had his cabin, his hunting, his wood carving. It was enough, he told himself. It had to be. Meanwhile, on the other side of Pine Hollow, Miss Eleanor Ashford was preparing for another day in her one-room schoolhouse. At 43, she was what polite society called a spinster, though that term hardly did justice to the complex woman who had shaped young minds in Pine Hollow for the past 8 years. Eleanor had arrived in town as a young widow. Her husband, William Ashford, had died of consumption just 2 years into their marriage. She had been 28 then, still young enough to remarry and start a family. But something in her had closed off after William's death. Perhaps it was the way his illness had drained their small savings. Perhaps it was the way his family back in Boston had blamed her for not taking better care of him. Whatever the reason, she had thrown herself into teaching with the dedication of someone who had no other outlet for her nurturing instincts. This morning, Eleanor stood before her small mirror, pinning her graying brown hair into its customary neat bun. She had been beautiful once, and still was in the eyes of those who looked closely enough to see past the severe hairstyle and practical dresses. Her eyes were a warm hazel that could sparkle with humor or flash with indignation, depending on the situation. Her hands were slender but strong, equally comfortable holding a piece of chalk or binding a child's scraped knee. Eleanor had heard the stories about Cade Thornwood, of course. In a town the size of Pine Hollow, everyone knew everyone else's business. She knew he was decent and hard-working, that he had never caused trouble or treated anyone poorly. She also knew that most people saw him as something of a curiosity, the gentle giant who could lift a full-grown steer but had never so much as raised his voice in anger. Their paths had crossed occasionally over the years. He would tip his hat politely when they passed on the street, and she would nod in acknowledgement. Once, when her schoolhouse roof had been damaged in a spring storm, he had arrived with his tools and materials and spent 2 days repairing it, refusing any payment beyond a jar of her homemade preserves. "Seems wrong to let the children's learning suffer on account of a leaky roof," he had said simply, his deep voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid his words might carry too much weight. Eleanor had watched him work from her classroom window, noting the careful precision with which he handled even the smallest tasks. His massive hands had somehow managed delicate repairs that would have challenged men half his size. There was something almost artistic in the way he worked, she had thought, though she had quickly dismissed such fanciful notions. The comfortable distance that Eleanor and Cade had maintained for years was about to become impossible to sustain. October of 1884 brought an early winter to the Appalachians, and with it came a crisis that would throw them together in ways neither could have imagined. On the morning of October 28th, Dr. Morrison, the town's only physician, received word that the youngest Morrison child at a farm 15 miles out had come down with a dangerous fever. The old doctor saddled his horse immediately, knowing that delays could mean death when it came to children's fevers. But Dr. Morrison was 72 years old, and his hands had started shaking badly in recent months. The town had been whispering about what would happen when their only medical help finally gave in to age. Eleanor was in her classroom when Martha Collins, the blacksmith's wife, burst through the door. "Dr. Morrison's horse came back without him," Martha gasped, her face pale with worry. "They found him collapsed near the creek. His heart gave out. Eleanor, you have medical training. The Morrison child needs help now, and you are the only one who can go." Eleanor felt her own heart hammering. She had learned basic medicine from Dr. Morrison over the years, absorbing knowledge about setting bones and treating fevers during their long conversations. But she had never claimed to be a healer. Still, a child's life hung in the balance. 20 minutes later, Eleanor was on horseback, riding hard toward the Morrison farm. The sky had been clear when she left town, but mountain weather changed fast. Dark clouds rolled in from the north, bringing with them the sharp scent of snow. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. She was still 5 miles from the Morrison farm when the first snowflakes began to fall. Within minutes, it became a full blizzard. The wind howled through the trees, driving snow so thick she could barely see her horse's ears. The temperature plummeted to 15 degrees below zero. The trail disappeared beneath a blanket of white. Eleanor's horse began to panic, dancing sideways, whinnying in fear. She tried to calm the animal, but her own hands were numb with cold. The horse reared suddenly, and Eleanor felt herself falling through the white void. She hit the snow hard, her ankle twisting beneath her. Pain shot up her leg. The horse bolted, disappearing into the storm. Eleanor tried to stand, but her ankle would not bear her weight. She crawled toward what she hoped was a tree, something to shelter behind. The wind cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper. Snow caked her eyelashes. Her fingers had gone beyond numb, to a dangerous absence of feeling. She knew what that meant. Frostbite. And worse, hypothermia. She thought of her students back in Pine Hollow. She thought of the Morrison child who needed her help. She thought of dying alone in the snow and how they would find her frozen body when the storm passed. A strange calm settled over her. This was how it ended then. 43 years of playing it safe, of keeping her heart locked away after William's death, of convincing herself that a quiet, solitary life was enough. What a waste, she thought, as her eyes drifted closed. What a terrible waste. But Eleanor Ashford was not meant to die that day. Cade Thornwood had been tracking a deer 3 miles from his cabin when the storm hit. A man of lesser experience might have been caught off guard, but Cade had learned to read the mountains from his Cherokee mother. He had seen the signs in the morning sky, in the way the birds flew south with unusual urgency, in the nervous stamping of his own horses. He had known the blizzard was coming, and he had started back toward his cabin early. He was less than a mile from home when he heard a sound that made him stop dead in his tracks. A horse's frightened whinny, coming from the direction of the main trail. No one should have been out in this weather. No one with any sense, anyway. But Cade knew that sometimes necessity drove people to take foolish risks. He changed direction, moving toward the sound with long, ground-eating strides. His height, usually a burden in the cramped spaces of town buildings, became an advantage in the deep snow. Where a normal-sized man would have been hip-deep, Cade's powerful legs carried him forward with relative ease. He found the horse first, a brown mare trembling with fear, reins trailing in the snow. The horse was saddled, which meant a rider somewhere nearby. Cade scanned the white landscape, his dark eyes searching for any sign of movement. Then he saw it, a dark shape against the snow, barely visible in the storm. A woman's cloak. Cade reached Eleanor in 4 long strides. She was unconscious, her face pale as the snow around her, her lips already taking on a dangerous blue tint. He did not hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms, marveling at how small and light she felt. Her head lolled against his chest. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. He had to get her warm, fast. Cade turned and ran toward his cabin, carrying Eleanor as easily as another man might carry a child. Behind him, he heard the low growl of wolves, drawn by the scent of vulnerability. He stopped long enough to let out a roar that echoed off the mountains, a sound that was half human and half something more primal. The wolves melted back into the storm. Even predators knew better than to challenge the mountain ghost. His cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a promise of salvation. Cade kicked open the door and carried Eleanor straight to his bed, the only place warm enough to save her. He had built the cabin himself, and the thick log walls kept out the worst of the weather. The fire in his stone hearth had burned down to coals, but it was still putting out heat. He worked quickly, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He removed Eleanor's wet cloak and boots, the sodden wool stockings beneath. Her traveling dress was damp, but not soaked through, so he left it on, covering her instead with his warmest blankets, heavy wool and bear fur that he had cured himself. He stoked the fire until flames leaped high, filling the cabin with warmth and golden light. Then he put water on to boil, adding herbs his mother had taught him about. Willow bark for pain, yarrow to encourage warmth back into cold limbs, golden seal to fight infection. While the tea steeped, he examined Eleanor's ankle. Swollen and already bruising, but not broken. A bad sprain, nothing more. He bound it carefully with strips of clean cloth, wrapping it firmly but not too tight. For the first time since finding her, Cade allowed himself to really look at the woman he had rescued. He recognized her, of course. Miss Eleanor Ashford, the schoolteacher. He had seen her in town, always proper and reserved, her hair in that severe bun, her dresses practical and unadorned. But now, with her hair coming loose from its pins, damp tendrils curling around her face, she looked younger, vulnerable, beautiful. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. For a moment she stared at the ceiling, confused. Then her gaze found Cade, who was sitting in a chair near the bed, and her eyes went wide. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Who are you?" "Safe. You are safe. I am Cade Thornwood. I found you in the storm." Recognition flickered across her face. The mountain man they talk about. Cade nodded, not sure if that was meant as a compliment or an accusation. "Some call me that. Most avoid me. You should rest now." Eleanor tried to sit up, then gasped as pain shot through her ankle. Cade was beside her in an instant, his large hand gently pressing her back down. "Your ankle is sprained. You need to keep it elevated and still. I have made tea that will help with the pain." He brought her the cup, supporting her head with one hand, while she drank with the other. Eleanor sipped the bitter brew, studying his face as she did. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the kindness in the lines around his mouth. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You saved my life." Cade shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Mountain takes care of mountain folk. Storm will not pass until morning. You should sleep." But Eleanor was looking around the cabin now, her teacher's eye noting details. The space was clean and well organized. Shelves lined one wall, holding books and tools. On a workbench near the window, she saw wood shavings and what looked like half-finished carvings. Small animals, beautifully detailed. "You carve," she said, pointing with her chin, since her hands were wrapped around the warm teacup. Cade glanced at his workbench, then back at her. "My mother taught me. She was Cherokee. Said big hands like mine needed to learn gentleness." He walked to the bench and picked up a small wooden bear, no larger than a child's fist. The detail was exquisite. Every claw, every tuft of fur, carved with obvious love and skill. He brought it to Eleanor and placed it in her hand. "For you. To remember you survived." Eleanor stared at the small bear, then at Cade's face. In all her 43 years, no one had ever given her something so thoughtful, so personal. Her late husband had bought her jewelry on their anniversary, expensive pieces chosen by a jeweler. But this rough wooden bear, carved by hands the size of dinner plates, touched something deep in her heart. "This is beautiful work," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Where did you learn such skill?" Cade settled back into his chair, uncomfortable with the attention, but warmed by her genuine appreciation. "Long winter evenings. Not much else to do up here. Mother said creating beauty keeps the soul from going cold." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind howling outside. Eleanor felt warmth slowly returning to her limbs, though her ankle throbbed with persistent pain. She watched Cade over the rim of her teacup, noting how carefully he moved despite his size, how he kept a respectful distance. "I know who you are," Cade said suddenly. "You are the teacher. Eleanor Ashford. Kids talk about the woman who reads them adventure stories, makes learning fun." Eleanor felt herself blushing, pleased that her work had been noticed. "You come to town, then? I did not think you left the mountain much." "Sometimes. at night, when folks do not stare." There was no self-pity in his voice, just a statement of fact. But Eleanor heard the loneliness beneath the words, recognized it because it matched her own. "People fear what they do not understand," she said softly. "They see your size and forget to look for the person underneath." Cade met her eyes then, really met them, for the first time. Most people never bother to look. "Well," Eleanor said, managing a small smile despite her pain and exhaustion, "I am looking now, and I see a man who carves beauty from wood and saves foolish teachers from dying in blizzards. That is not someone to fear, Mr. Thornwood. That is someone to thank." Something shifted in the air between them. A wall coming down, a connection forming. Cade felt it, though he did not have words for it. This woman, lying in his bed with her ankle wrapped and her hair coming loose from its pins, saw him. Not the giant, not the half-breed, just Cade. The storm raged through the night, wind howling like wolves around the cabin walls. Eleanor drifted in and out of sleep, waking occasionally to find Cade tending the fire or checking her ankle. Each time she woke, he would bring her water or more of the herbal tea, his massive presence somehow comforting rather than frightening. By morning, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of fresh snow. Cade helped Eleanor to a chair by the fire while he prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal porridge and dried venison. She watched him move around the kitchen area, noting how he had to duck beneath the ceiling beams, how carefully he handled the delicate china cups that looked like toys in his enormous hands. "The trail will be passable by afternoon," he said, not looking at her as he stirred the pot. "I can take you back to town then." Eleanor felt a strange disappointment at his words, though she could not have explained why. Of course she needed to return to town. Her students would be worried. Martha Collins would have the whole town searching for her by now. But part of her wanted to stay in this warm cabin, in this peaceful space where a lonely giant carved beauty from wood and saw her as more than just the prim schoolteacher. "That would be kind," she said. "The Morrison child, though. I was riding to help when the storm caught me. Dr. Morrison died yesterday morning," Cade said quietly. "His heart. The child's fever broke on its own. Sometimes the body heals itself if given time." Eleanor felt relief mixed with sorrow. Relief that the child had survived, sorrow for the old doctor who had been her friend and mentor. And another feeling she did not want to examine too closely, a selfish gratitude that circumstances had brought her to this cabin, to this man. They ate in companionable silence, and then Cade went out to clear a path and ready his horse for the journey back to town. Eleanor sat by the fire, studying the cabin in the morning light. She noticed things she had missed in her exhaustion the night before. Books on the shelves, real books, well worn from reading. A chess set carved from light and dark wood, the pieces intricate representations of forest animals. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters, filling the air with their subtle fragrance. On a small table near the bed, she saw a silver locket tarnished with age. She picked it up carefully, opening it to reveal a tiny portrait of a woman who must have been Cade's mother. The resemblance was there in the eyes, the set of the jaw. Eleanor felt a pang of recognition. She wore a similar locket around her own neck, though she kept it hidden beneath her high-collared dresses. Inside was a photograph of William, her late husband. For 15 years, she had worn that locket every day, a tangible reminder of the love she had lost. Lately, though, she had found herself leaving it in the drawer more often than not because she had forgotten William, but because she was tired of wearing her grief like a badge of honor. She was still holding Cade's mother's locket when he returned, stamping snow from his boots. He saw what she held and froze in the doorway. "I am sorry," Eleanor said quickly, setting the locket back on the table. "I did not mean to pry." "It is all right. That was my mother's, Ruby. She died 5 winters ago. She was beautiful. You have her eyes." Cade moved closer, picking up the locket with surprising gentleness. "She used to say these mountains were in our blood, Cherokee blood, that we belonged here even when others said we did not." "Where is your father?" Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw pain flicker across Cade's face. "Gone. When I was 3 years old, he looked at me and decided I was too much of a freak to raise. A half-breed abomination, he called me. Left the next day and never came back. Mama raised me alone." Eleanor felt anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. What kind of man abandons his own child? The kind who cares more about what people think than what is right. Cade set the locket down carefully. "He taught me something, though. Taught me what kind of father I never want to be." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Eleanor stood, testing her weight on her injured ankle. It hurt, but she could manage. "We should go," she said, suddenly needing to put distance between herself and the feelings stirring in her chest. "The town will be worried." The ride back to Pine Hollow took 2 hours, Cade leading his massive draft horse through the snowdrifts while Eleanor rode. He had insisted she take the saddle, saying his legs were built for walking. They spoke little during the journey, but the silence was comfortable, almost intimate. When they reached the edge of town, Cade stopped. "I will leave you here. People will talk less if you ride in alone." Eleanor wanted to protest, to tell him that she did not care what people thought. But she did care. She was the school teacher, a role model for the children. Her reputation mattered, not for her own sake, but for theirs. "Thank you, Mr. Thornwood, for everything." "Cade," he said. "My name is Cade." "Then you must call me Eleanor." He helped her down from the horse, his hands spanning her waist easily. For a moment they stood close, his warmth radiating through their winter clothes. Eleanor looked up at him, seeing not the giant that frightened children, but the gentle man who had saved her life and asked nothing in return. "Goodbye, Eleanor." She rode into town alone, acutely aware of his absence beside her. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks during which Eleanor threw herself into teaching with renewed vigor, trying not to think about the night she had spent in Cade Thornwood's cabin, trying not to remember the way his hands had been so gentle when binding her ankle, trying not to hear his deep voice saying her name in that careful way, as if her name was something precious. But her body would not let her forget. It started with morning sickness, a queasy feeling that sent her running for the chamber pot before breakfast. Then came the exhaustion, bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest seemed to cure. She attributed it to the ordeal of the storm, to stress, to anything but the truth she was desperately trying to avoid. It was Martha Collins who finally forced her to face reality. "Eleanor Ashford, you sit yourself down this instant," Martha commanded, finding Eleanor swaying slightly as she tried to organize supplies in the back room of the schoolhouse. "When was your last monthly course?" The blunt question hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing backward through recent weeks. The storm had been October 28th. It was now late November, and she had not bled since early October. "That is impossible," she whispered. "I am 43 years old, Martha. Women my age do not just become pregnant." Martha's expression was knowing and not unsympathetic. "My own sister had her last baby at 45, honey. Nature does not always follow our expectations. And from the look of you, I would say you were about 6 weeks along." Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. Pregnant. At her age. Unmarried. After one night of weakness with a man she barely knew. A man the entire town would assume had taken advantage of the respectable schoolteacher. Her reputation would be ruined. She would lose her position, her home, everything she had built for herself. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. "First thing is to be certain. Then you need to tell the father. I assume it is Cade Thornwood?" Eleanor's head snapped up. "How did you know?" Martha smiled sadly. "Darling, half the town saw him carry you in from that storm. And I have eyes. I saw the way you looked at each other when he brought you back. Like two people who had found something unexpected." Eleanor pressed her hands to her face, feeling tears threaten. "I cannot trap him into a marriage he does not want. He has been alone his whole life, rejected by everyone. I will not be another person who uses him." "Then you need to tell him the truth and let him make his own choice." "But Eleanor, that man has been waiting his whole life for someone to choose him. Do not make that decision for him." 2 days later, Eleanor rode out to Cade's cabin. The journey took longer than she remembered, and by the time she arrived, her back was aching and her stomach was rolling with nerves. She found him in the barn behind the cabin, repairing a saddle, his large hands working the leather with practiced skill. "Eleanor," he said, straightening when he saw her. His face lit up with genuine pleasure that made her heart ache. "I thought you might not want to see me again." She dismounted carefully, her movements cautious. "I need to tell you something, and you need to listen without interrupting." Cade set down his tools, giving her his full attention. "All right. I am with child, your child. I am 43 years old, and this should not be possible, but it is. I did not come here to trap you or demand anything. You deserved to know. That is all." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of horses shifting in their stalls. Cade's expression had gone completely blank, his dark eyes unreadable. Eleanor found herself holding her breath, waiting for condemnation or rejection or angry accusations about her motives. Instead, he sank slowly onto a hay bale, his massive frame suddenly looking somehow diminished. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. Martha Collins helped me confirm it. There is no doubt." Cade stared at the barn floor for a long moment. Eleanor felt her heart breaking a little more with each second of silence. She had known this was a risk, that he might see the pregnancy as an attempt to trap him, to force marriage with a woman he had barely looked at before that storm-bound night. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a complexity of emotions she could not entirely read. Pain, fear, hope, determination. "What do you want from me, Eleanor? What do you expect me to do?" The question hurt more than she had anticipated. "I do not want anything from you. I thought you had a right to know, that is all. I can manage on my own. I have been doing it for years." "That is not what I meant." Cade stood, taking a step toward her. "Eleanor, I need to know what you want, whether you want this child, whether you would consider marriage, for the child's sake." "For the child's sake." The words hit her like a physical blow,
confirming her worst fears.
He was offering marriage as a duty, a responsibility, not because he had any real feelings for her. "I appreciate the offer," she said stiffly, "but I will not trap you into a marriage you do not want. The child and I will manage perfectly well without seeing you obligated." "Stop." Cade's voice was sharp enough to make her look at him in surprise. "Just stop talking about trapping and managing and doing things alone. That is not what I meant." He ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Eleanor, I have been alone my whole life. I never thought I would have a family. Never thought any woman would want to build a life with someone like me." He gestured at himself, his voice dropping. "Look at me, Eleanor. 8 feet tall. Hands that can snap wood like kindling. Most women see a monster, not a husband. But this child, our child, deserves better than growing up without a father. I know what that is like, and I will not let it happen to my son or daughter." Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, though whether from disappointment or relief, she could not say. "So you are proposing marriage out of duty?" "I am proposing marriage because it is the right thing to do, for all of us." Cade's voice was firm now, certain. "We are both adults, Eleanor. We both know this situation is not ideal, but we can make the best of it. I will be a good husband to you, and a good father to the child. I promise you that." It was not the romantic proposal she had once dreamed of, but it was honest and practical, and offered security for both her and the baby. Eleanor found herself nodding before she had fully processed the decision. "All right, for the child's sake." Neither of them mentioned love, though both were thinking about it. Eleanor with regret for what this arrangement lacked, and Cade with hope that perhaps, given time, duty might grow into something deeper. The wedding took place 1 week later, on November 15th, 1884. It was held in the small wooden church at the center of Pine Hollow, with only a handful of witnesses present. Eleanor had wanted something small and understated, partly to avoid drawing attention to the rushed timeline, but mostly because elaborate celebrations felt inappropriate for what was essentially a business arrangement. The wedding dress had belonged to Cade's mother, carefully preserved in tissue paper and cedar chips for over 30 years. When Ruby Thornwood had married Cade's father in 1850, the cream-colored silk had been the finest thing she had ever owned. Now, as Eleanor stood before the mirror in the back room of the church, adjusting the fitted bodice that had required only minor alterations, she felt the weight of history and hope that the dress carried. "You look beautiful, dear," said Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, as she made final adjustments to the simple veil. Cade's mother would be so pleased to see her dress worn again, especially for such a joyous occasion. Eleanor nodded, though joy was not exactly what she was feeling. Nervous anticipation, certainly. Relief that she and the baby would have security and respectability. Even a cautious optimism about building a life with a man she was beginning to understand and respect. But joy seemed too strong a word for a marriage born of necessity rather than love. Cade stood at the altar, looking uncomfortable in his best suit, his massive frame making even the church's high ceiling seem inadequate. But when Eleanor walked down the aisle, something in his expression shifted. The careful formality in his dark eyes gave way to something warmer, more genuine. "You look," he began, when she reached his side, then stopped, apparently at a loss for words. "The dress fits well," Eleanor replied practically, though she was blushing slightly at the admiration in his voice. Reverend Thomas Bradford cleared his throat and began the traditional words, speaking of love and honor and commitment until death parted them. When they reached the vows, both Eleanor and Cade spoke their promises with quiet sincerity, though neither met the other's eyes. "You may kiss the bride," the pastor announced. For the first time, Eleanor felt a flutter of real nervousness. They had not kissed since that night during the storm, had not touched beyond the occasional brush of fingers when he helped her from the wagon. Cade's hands were gentle as they framed her face, his touch as careful as if she were made of spun glass. When his lips met hers, the kiss was soft and respectful, lasting only a moment before he drew back. But it was enough to remind Eleanor of the tenderness she had glimpsed that stormy night, enough to make her wonder if perhaps this arrangement might become something more than mere convenience. The reception was held at the boarding house, where Mrs. Jenkins had prepared a simple meal for the small gathering. Eleanor found herself studying her new husband as he accepted congratulations and best wishes from their neighbors. There was an awkwardness about him in social situations, a careful formality that suggested he was never quite comfortable being the center of attention. Pete Sullivan, the elderly neighbor who had been friends with Cade's mother, clapped the younger man on the shoulder. "Never thought I would see the day, boy. Your mama would be proud." When they finally returned to the ranch, to what was now their shared home, the weight of their new reality settled between them like a physical presence. Eleanor carried her small valise of belongings, looking around the main room with fresh eyes now that this was to be her permanent residence. "I have cleared space in the bedroom," Cade said, his voice carefully neutral. "The dresser and half the wardrobe are yours now."
I can sleep in the barn if you would prefer privacy while you are carrying. "That is not necessary," Eleanor replied, though the thought of sharing a bed with this man she barely knew sent her pulse racing for reasons she did not want to examine too closely. "We are married now. Married couples share bedrooms." But that night, as they lay in the darkness on opposite sides of the bed, a careful distance between them, both wondered if duty would ever become something more. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the mountains in white silence. 300 miles away, in Cedar Ridge, the largest town in this part of West Virginia, a very different conversation was taking place. Silas Blackwood stood in his office at Blackwood Coal Company headquarters, studying a map spread across his mahogany desk. He was 55 years old, tall and lean, with cold gray eyes and the kind of distinguished looks that made people trust him. It was a trust he had spent 30 years exploiting for profit. On the map before him, one parcel of land was circled in red ink. It sat high in the mountains above Pine Hollow, encompassing Cade Thornwood's cabin and the surrounding forest. Beside the circle, in Blackwood's neat handwriting, were the words, "Largest coal vein in West Virginia. Estimated value, $2 million. Deputy Garrett Hayes stood on the other side of the desk, hat in hand, waiting for instructions. Hayes was 38, broad-shouldered, with the look of a man who enjoyed using his authority to push people around. "The half-breed still refuses to sell," Hayes reported. "Offered him $500 for the land. He turned it down flat." Blackwood's thin lips compressed into a line. $500 for land worth $2 million. The ignorant savage does not even know what he is sitting on. "So what do we do, sir?" Blackwood looked up from the map, his eyes calculating. "We make him disappear. Or better yet, we make him a criminal. Plant evidence. I want that land by spring when we start the new mining operation." "What kind of evidence?" "Timber theft from federal land. The penalty is 5 years in federal prison. Plenty of time for us to claim the property for unpaid taxes and back fees.
By the time he gets out, if he gets out, that land will be ours." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "There are folks in Pine Hollow who know Thornwood. They might not believe he is a thief." "Then we make them believe it." Blackwood pulled out a leather-bound ledger, flipping through pages of names and numbers. "We have done this before, Deputy. 6 times in the last 3 years. Not one of those families still owns their land." "When do we start?" "Tonight, while he is distracted." Blackwood smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "I hear there is a woman at his cabin now. A wife. Even better. When we arrest him, she will be left alone and helpless. Easier to pressure her into selling." Hayes nodded, putting on his hat. "I will need 3 men and 20 red oak logs from the Federal Reserve. Take what you need. Just make sure the evidence is solid. I want this done right." After Hayes left, Blackwood returned to his map, running his finger along the proposed route for the new rail line that would carry coal from the mountains to the cities back east. Everything was coming together perfectly. The land acquisition, the political connections, the carefully placed bribes that ensured cooperation from local law enforcement. Cade Thornwood was just another obstacle to be removed. Blackwood had removed dozens before him. One more half-breed mountain man would make no difference to anyone. But Silas Blackwood had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated Eleanor Ashford Thornwood, the school teacher who had spent 15 years teaching children how to think logically, how to research thoroughly, and how to stand up for what was right, even when the world told them to sit down. The war for their family had begun, but neither Blackwood nor Cade yet understood that the most dangerous person in the room was often the one everyone underestimated. The first 2 weeks of their marriage fell into an awkward rhythm of politeness and careful consideration. Cade rose before dawn to tend his trap lines and check his small herd of goats, allowing Eleanor privacy to dress and prepare breakfast. She cooked and cleaned with efficient competence, treating the domestic tasks as she might any other job requiring skill and attention to detail. In the evenings, they sat by the fire reading, she with her books of poetry and literature, he with farming journals and the Bible his mother had left him. Occasionally, one would comment on something interesting, leading to careful conversations that revealed more about their personalities and values. They were learning each other the way one might learn a new language, slowly and with frequent misunderstandings. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Eleanor first watched Cade carve. She had noticed the wooden animals scattered around the cabin, small, beautifully detailed figures that captured the spirit of living creatures with remarkable skill. But watching him create one was entirely different. His massive hands moved with delicate precision, the knife becoming an extension of his thoughts. Wood shavings fell like snow around his feet as a deer slowly emerged from the piece of pine he held. Eleanor set aside her book, mesmerized by the transformation. "You are very talented," she observed. "How long have you been carving?" Cade did not look up from his work. "My mother taught me when I was small, said it would help me learn to be gentle with things, to use my hands for creating instead of just working." Eleanor could see the truth of that philosophy in the way he handled the knife, in the patient care he took with each detail. "What made you choose animals?" "They were the first ones that were not afraid of me. When I was a boy, some of the kids in town used to dare each other to get close to the giant. Made me feel like a monster sometimes. But animals, they do not care how big you are if you are gentle with them." The confession was quietly offered, without self-pity, but it gave Eleanor new insight into the man she had married. She could imagine him as a child, already towering over his peers, trying to find his place in a world that saw him as a curiosity rather than a person. "Children can be cruel," she said softly. "I have seen it in my classroom, the way they sometimes treat anyone who is different." Cade glanced up from his carving to meet her eyes. "Did you ever feel different?"
Eleanor considered the question seriously.
"Always. Too bookish for most of the girls my age. Too interested in ideas instead of gossip. Even in my marriage to William, I sometimes felt like I was playing a role that did not quite fit." "And now?" Cade asked. The question weighted with implications about their current arrangement. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, seeing something vulnerable in his dark eyes that encouraged honesty. "Now I feel like perhaps being different is not such a terrible thing. Perhaps it just means I needed to find someone who understood what it was like." Something shifted in Cade's expression, a subtle warming that made Eleanor's heart skip. For a moment, the careful formality between them cracked, revealing the possibility of something deeper. "I never thought I would have a wife," he said quietly, his hands stilling on the carving. "Never thought any woman would want to share a life with someone like me."
"And I never thought I would marry again," Eleanor replied.
"Especially not under these circumstances. But you know what, Cade Thornwood? I am not sorry." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after a long night, gradual and warming, transforming his stern features into something almost beautiful. He set down his carving and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair so their eyes were level. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he placed his large hand over hers. "I am not sorry either, Eleanor." They sat that way for several minutes, hands linked, fire crackling, the first real bridge built between duty and something that might eventually become love. But in the darkness beyond their warm cabin, betrayal was already in motion. Jacob Winters had been a lumberjack for 20 years, working the forests of West Virginia with skill and pride. He was 35 years old, married with 2 small children, and desperately in debt. The mine where his brother worked had collapsed last spring, and Jacob had taken on his brother's widow and children, along with his own family. 6 mouths to feed on a lumberjack's wages. When Deputy Garrett Hayes approached him in the Pine Hollow Saloon with an offer of $100 for an evening's work, Jacob had been too desperate to ask many questions. $100 was more than he made in 2 months. It would clear his debts and keep his family fed through the winter. All he had to do was help move some timber from one location to another, no questions asked. It was not until he saw the federal land markers that Jacob realized what he was being asked to do. They were stealing timber from protected forest. 20 massive red oak logs worth at least $500 on the open market. Hayes and 2 other men were loading the logs onto wagons, working quickly in the November darkness. "Where are we taking these?" Jacob asked, his conscience beginning to trouble him. "Thornwood's property, the half-breed up the mountain." Jacob knew Cade Thornwood by reputation, knew he was an honest man who kept to himself and never caused trouble. "Why are we putting stolen timber on his land?" Hayes looked at him with cold eyes. "Because Blackwood Coal wants his property, and this is how we are going to get it. You have a problem with that?" Jacob thought of his children, of the way his daughter coughed in the cold, of the shoes his son had outgrown months ago. He thought of the $100 promised, money that could change everything for his struggling family. "No problem," he said, hating himself even as the words left his mouth. They finished the work in 3 hours, stacking the stolen logs in Cade's storage shed while he was in town purchasing winter supplies. Hayes paid Jacob the promised $100 in cash, then gripped his shoulder hard enough to hurt.
"You speak one word of this to anyone, and your whole family will pay. Understand?" Jacob nodded, pocketing the money that suddenly felt like 30 pieces of silver burning against his chest. 2 days later, on November 28th, Deputy Hayes and 3 armed men rode up to Cade Thornwood's cabin. Eleanor was inside preparing lunch, now 12 weeks pregnant and beginning to show. She heard the horses and looked out the window, recognizing Hayes from his occasional visits to town. Cade emerged from the barn, wiping wood shavings from his hands. He saw the men and stopped, his body language shifting to something more alert, more wary. "Cade Thornwood," Hayes called out. "You are under arrest for timber theft from federal land." Eleanor's blood went cold. She moved to the door, opening it despite Cade's warning gesture for her to stay inside. "There must be some mistake," Cade said, his voice calm but firm. "I have never stolen timber. I have proper permits for all the wood I cut." Hayes swung down from his horse, pulling out a pair of iron shackles. "We already checked your storage shed. 20 red oak logs, each one marked with federal property stamps. That is $500 worth of timber, Thornwood. That is 5 years in federal prison." "I do not know what you are talking about. Those logs were not there yesterday when I was working in that shed." "Sure they were not." Hayes gestured to his men. "Search the premises." Eleanor watched in horror as the 3 men dismounted and headed for the storage shed. Within minutes, they emerged, confirming Hayes's accusation. 20 red oak logs, clearly marked as federal property, stacked in Cade's shed. "This is a lie," Eleanor burst out, stepping off the porch despite the pain in her still healing ankle. "My husband is an honest man. He would not steal so much as a chicken, let alone federal timber." "Ma'am, you need to step back," Hayes warned. "This is official business." "Official business." Eleanor's voice rose with indignation. "This is a setup. Anyone with half a brain can see that. Who is paying you to frame my husband, Deputy Hayes?" Hayes's face darkened. "Careful, lady. Accusations like that can get you in trouble, too." "Eleanor," Cade said quietly, his hand gentle on her shoulder, "go back inside." "I will not. They cannot just arrest you for something you did not do." "Yes, they can. At least until this gets sorted out in court." Cade's voice was resigned, as if he had always known something like this would happen eventually. His whole life had taught him that the world was not fair to people like him. Hayes snapped the shackles on Cade's wrists. "You will have a hearing in Cedar Ridge in 3 weeks. Judge Morgan presides. Until then, you will be held in the Pine Hollow jail." Eleanor felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. This was not just about justice anymore. This was about her husband, about the father of her unborn child, about a good man being destroyed by corrupt forces. She had spent 43 years being careful and proper and following the rules. But watching them lead Cade away in chains awakened something she had not known existed within her. She would fight for him. She would use every skill she had learned in her years of teaching and research. She would prove his innocence, or die trying. As they loaded Cade onto a wagon for the ride to town, he looked back at Eleanor standing on their porch, one hand protectively over her growing belly. "Take care of yourself," he called. "Take care of our baby." "I will take care of all of us," Eleanor called back, and there was steel in her voice that made even Hayes
glance at her twice. "I promise you that, Cade Thornwood. I will bring you home." After they were gone, Eleanor stood alone in the sudden silence. Around her, the mountains rose like sentinels, indifferent to human drama. Snow began to fall, soft and quiet, covering everything in white. She placed both hands on her belly, where their child grew. "They have no idea who they are dealing with," she whispered. "No idea at all." The next morning, Eleanor rode into Pine Hollow and went directly to the home of Pete Sullivan, the elderly neighbor who had been at their wedding. Pete was 68 years old, weathered and wise, with eyes that missed nothing. "Pete, I need your help. They arrested Cade for stealing federal timber." Pete's face darkened. "That boy never stole nothing in his life. This smells like Blackwood coal. They have been trying to buy his land for 2 years now. Tell me everything you know about Blackwood coal." Over the next hour, Pete laid out a story of systematic corruption. Blackwood Coal Company had been expanding their operations throughout West Virginia for a decade. Wherever they wanted land, mysterious crimes would occur. Timber theft, cattle rustling, vandalism. The landowners would be arrested or financially ruined. Within months, Blackwood would swoop in and buy the property for a fraction of its value. 6 families in the last 3 years, Pete said, ticking them off on his gnarled fingers. The Johnsons, the Martins, the Chens, the O'Briens, the Washingtons, the Kowalskis. All of them ended up losing their land to Blackwood. And every single one of those properties turned out to have valuable coal deposits. Eleanor felt the pieces clicking into place in her mind. This was not personal. This was business. Cade's land must have something Blackwood wanted badly enough to break the law. "I need to see those property records," she said, "and I need to talk to those families who lost their land." "Martha Collins will help you. Her husband Tom knows everyone in 3 counties. And Eleanor," Pete's voice grew serious, "be careful. Silas Blackwood is not a man who takes kindly to people interfering with his plans." "Let him try to stop me," Eleanor said, her jaw set in determination. "I have been underestimated my whole life. Time to make that work in my favor." Over the next week, Eleanor conducted an investigation that would have done any detective proud. She rode to Cedar Ridge and examined the land records at the courthouse, documenting every property Blackwood had acquired in the past 5 years. She visited the families Pete had mentioned, listening to their stories of harassment and false accusations. The pattern was clear and damning. Every family had been targeted shortly after geological surveys revealed coal deposits on their land. Every arrest had been made by Deputy Garrett Hayes or his associates. Every property had been sold to Blackwood Coal within 6 months of the arrest. Eleanor documented everything in a leather-bound notebook, creating timelines and connections, building a case with the methodical care of a scholar. She interviewed shopkeepers who remembered Hayes and his men drinking together. She found the surveyor who had mapped Cade's property and confirmed massive coal deposits, estimated value in the millions. But finding evidence and proving it in court were 2 different things. She needed a smoking gun, something that directly connected Blackwood to the timber theft. And she needed someone willing to testify, someone who had been part of the conspiracy. It was Martha Collins who provided the breakthrough. "Eleanor, I was in town yesterday when I saw Jacob Winters at the Mercantile. He was buying more supplies than a lumberjack could afford. New boots for his whole family, a ham, sugar, coffee. When I asked how business was going, he looked guilty as sin and practically ran out of the store." "Jacob Winters," Eleanor repeated, the name clicking in her memory. "He does lumbering work, correct? Has for 20 years. Honest as they come, usually." But he has been struggling since his brother died, and he took in the widow and her children. 6 mouths to feed, on one man's wages. Eleanor felt a chill of understanding. If you were desperate enough and someone offered you money to do something questionable, would you take it? Martha's eyes widened. You think Jacob helped plant that timber. I think someone paid him to move it, and I think his conscience is eating him alive. Finding Jacob Winters proved easier than Eleanor expected. He was working a stand of trees 5 miles outside Pine Hollow, the rhythmic sound of his axe echoing through the forest. When he saw Eleanor approaching on horseback, his face went pale. Mrs. Thornwood, I heard about Cade. Terrible thing. Eleanor dismounted, studying the younger man carefully. She had taught for long enough to recognize guilt when she saw it. Jacob, I am going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Your soul may depend on it. Jacob's axe stilled. Ma'am, did Deputy Hayes pay you to move federal timber onto my husband's property? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind in the trees and the distant call of a crow. Jacob's face worked through a dozen expressions, guilt and fear and shame chasing each other across his features. Finally, he set down his axe and sank onto a fallen log. I have 6 children to feed, my own 2 and my brother's 4. Hayes offered me $100. That is more money than I make in 2 months. Eleanor felt anger and pity warring in her chest. So you let an innocent man take the blame for your crime. Jacob's head dropped into his hands. I know what I did was wrong. I have not slept right since. But if I confess, Hayes said he would hurt my family. And if you stay silent, my husband goes to prison for 5 years for something he did not do. My child grows up without a father. Is that justice, Jacob Winters? No, ma'am, it is not. Eleanor sat beside him on the log, her voice softening. I am not asking you to sacrifice your family, but I am asking you to help me save mine. If you testify about what really happened, if you tell the truth in court, I believe we can protect you. There is a federal marshal named Samuel Cooper who specializes in corruption cases. He can offer you protection in exchange for testimony. Jacob looked up, hope and fear mingling in his eyes. You think the marshal would really help? I know he would. Because this is not just about one case of framed timber theft. This is about systematic corruption that has destroyed families across this region. Your testimony could bring down Silas Blackwood and everyone working with him. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he nodded. I will do it. God help me, I will do it. But Mrs. Thornwood, you need to understand something. Blackwood does not just have Hayes working for him. He has judges, politicians, businessmen. He is connected all the way to Charleston. Then we will need to be smarter than all of them, Eleanor said, standing and brushing bark from her skirt. Can you meet me at Reverend Bradford's house tomorrow evening? Bring any paperwork Hayes gave you, any receipts or notes. I will be there. As Eleanor rode back toward town, she felt the first stirrings of hope. She had evidence. She had a witness. Now she needed allies and a plan. But she did not yet know that Silas Blackwood had already anticipated her investigation. Even now, a letter was making its way from Boston to Pine Hollow, a letter that would threaten everything she held dear and prove that her enemies were more dangerous and more connected than she had imagined. The war was far from over. In fact, it was about to get much, much worse.
The letter arrived on a cold December morning, delivered by a well-dressed courier who seemed oddly nervous for someone carrying what appeared to be simple correspondence. Eleanor accepted the expensive envelope with growing unease, noting the Boston postmark and the unfamiliar law firm embossed on the return address. She waited until the courier had departed before opening it, some instinct warning her that the contents would not be pleasant. She was right. The letterhead read, "Ashford and Whitmore, attorneys at law," and the contents made Eleanor's blood run cold. "Dear Mrs. Ashford," it began, pointedly using her maiden name, "we represent the estate of the late William Ashford and his surviving family members. It has come to our attention that you are currently expecting a child conceived out of wedlock. As the deceased's family holds legitimate interest in any potential Ashford heirs, we hereby demand immediate custody of said child upon birth. Furthermore, should you resist this reasonable request, we are prepared to expose your immoral conduct to the territorial authorities and pursue full legal action. The Ashford family cannot allow their good name to be tarnished by association with illegitimate offspring born of scandalous circumstances. You have 7 days to respond to this demand and make arrangements for the transfer of custody. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action." The letter was signed by Cornelius Ashford, Esquire, William's older brother. Eleanor had met him only once, at William's funeral 15 years ago. He had been cold and dismissive then, barely acknowledging her presence. The Ashford family had never approved of William's marriage to a woman they considered beneath their social station. Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, the letter trembling in her hands. The Ashfords were one of Boston's oldest and wealthiest families. They had resources and connections that stretched across the country. And somehow, they had learned about her pregnancy, but appeared to have no knowledge of her marriage to Cade. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone had deliberately fed them incomplete information, setting up a legal attack designed to destroy her while Cade sat helpless in jail. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This was not just about stealing land. This was a coordinated assault meant to dismantle her family from every angle. Eleanor forced herself to think clearly, to analyze the situation with the same logical mind she used to teach geometry and literature. The Ashfords claimed rights to any potential Ashford heir, but her child was not an Ashford heir. Her child was a Thornwood, conceived and carried within a legal marriage. She had proof, documentation, witnesses. But the letter made one thing crystal clear. Whoever was orchestrating this campaign had done their research. They knew about her late husband's family. They knew the Ashfords would be interested in any child connected to their bloodline, especially since William had been their only heir. And they had deliberately withheld information about her marriage to Cade, painting her as an unwed mother engaging in scandalous behavior. Martha Collins arrived within the hour, having seen the courier in town and sensing trouble. She found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread before her, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with determination. "What has happened?" Martha asked, pouring tea without being asked. Eleanor handed her the letter. Martha read it quickly, her expression growing increasingly outraged. "This is monstrous. They are claiming rights to a child that is not even theirs, and they are calling you immoral when you are legally married?" "They do not know I am married," Eleanor said quietly. "Someone made sure of that. Someone who wants me distracted, threatened, and unable to focus on clearing Cade's name." Blackwood. It has to be. This is too coordinated to be coincidence. He frames Cade for timber theft. While I am investigating that, he feeds false information to the Ashfords to create a second legal battle.
two fronts, Martha. He is attacking us on two fronts." Martha's weathered hands covered Eleanor's. "Then we fight on two fronts. You are not alone in this, Eleanor. The whole community is behind you." But even as Martha spoke words of encouragement, Eleanor felt the weight of what she was facing pressing down on her shoulders. She was nearly 4 months pregnant now. Her husband was in jail, and now she had to prepare for a legal battle with one of Boston's most powerful families. The odds seemed insurmountable. That evening, Eleanor called another meeting at Reverend Bradford's house. The group had grown since the first gathering.
Along with Pete Sullivan, Martha Collins, Jacob Winters, and Mary Chen, there were now 3 other families who had lost property to Blackwood. A newspaper editor from Cedar Ridge, and most importantly, Federal Marshal Samuel Cooper. Sam Cooper was 58 years old, with gray hair, a scarred face, and eyes that had seen too much corruption to be surprised by anything. He had been investigating Blackwood coal for 6 months, following a trail of suspicious land acquisitions across 3 states. Cade's case had caught his attention because it fit a pattern he had been documenting. Eleanor presented everything she had gathered: the property records showing Blackwood's systematic targeting of land with coal deposits, the timeline of arrests always involving Deputy Hayes, Jacob Winters's confession about being paid to move the timber, the geological survey confirming millions of dollars worth of coal under Cade's property. Then she showed them the letter from the Ashford lawyers. This is the same tactic Blackwood used on the Chen family. Mary Chen spoke up, her English carefully pronounced. "When my husband tried to fight the false charges, suddenly there were problems with our immigration papers that had been legal for 20 years. It was meant to overwhelm us, make us give up." Marshal Cooper studied the Ashford letter with a professional eye. "This is definitely coordinated. The question is, can we prove Blackwood is behind both attacks?" Eleanor pulled out another document, this one a telegram she had obtained from the Cedar Ridge Telegraph Office through careful questioning and a small bribe. The telegram had been sent from Blackwood's office to a Boston address 3 days after Cade's arrest. The message was brief. Subject: married to widow of William Ashford. Child expected spring. Family may wish to pursue interests. The address matched the law firm that had sent her the threatening letter. "And how do we get that?" Martha asked. "Someone would have to go to Cedar Ridge and search Blackwood's office," Eleanor said quietly. "Someone he would not suspect of being a threat." Every eye in the room turned to her. She was a woman, and women were often dismissed as no threat at all. She was pregnant, which made her seem even more harmless. And she had a legitimate reason to be in Cedar Ridge, as the hearing for Cade's case was scheduled there in 2 weeks. "Absolutely not," Cooper said immediately. "If you are caught, Blackwood could have you arrested for trespassing or worse. You are pregnant, Mrs. Thornwood. The risk is too great." "The risk is greater if I do nothing," Eleanor countered. "My husband faces 5 years in prison. My child may be taken away by people who have no right to her. I will not sit idle while my family is destroyed." She felt the baby flutter inside her, as if in agreement, drawing strength from the life within. "I am not asking permission," she continued, her voice firm. "I am telling you what I am going to do. If you want to help me plan it safely, I welcome your assistance, but I am doing this regardless." The group exchanged glances. Finally, Marshal Cooper nodded slowly. "If you are determined to do this, then we do it right. We minimize the risks and maximize your chances of success." Over the next hour, they planned the operation with military precision. Eleanor would travel to Cedar Ridge under the pretense of consulting with lawyers about the Ashford claim. Mary Chen would accompany her,
ostensibly as a midwife concerned about the pregnancy. In reality, Mary would be the lookout and getaway driver. Pete and Jacob would travel separately, ready to create diversions if needed. Marshal Cooper would position himself at the Cedar Ridge Courthouse, maintaining a legitimate official presence that might deter Blackwood from taking drastic action if Eleanor was discovered. The key would be timing. Blackwood held regular meetings every Friday afternoon with his mine supervisors, meetings that typically lasted 3 hours. His office would be empty but unlocked, as his secretary left early on Fridays. Eleanor would have a window of opportunity, but it would be narrow and dangerous. "One more thing," Cooper said as the meeting broke up. "Mrs. Thornwood, if you find what we need, you need to get out immediately. Do not wait. Do not try to gather more. Blackwood is a dangerous man. He has already shown he is willing to break laws to get what he wants. There is no telling what he would do to protect himself if cornered." Eleanor nodded, but privately she knew she would take whatever risks were necessary. This was about more than just clearing Cade's name. This was about justice for all the families Blackwood had destroyed. This was about proving that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor visited Cade in the Pine Hollow jail every afternoon, bringing him food and updates. She could not tell him about the plan, not with guards potentially listening, but she held his hand through the bars and promised him that everything would be all right. "You should not be taking risks," Cade said, his eyes going to her rounded belly. "You are carrying our child. That is what matters most." "Our child deserves a father who is free," Eleanor replied firmly. "She deserves to grow up knowing that her parents fought for what was right, even when it was dangerous." On the evening before she was scheduled to leave for Cedar Ridge, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter to her unborn child. Her hand rested on her belly as she wrote, feeling the strong kicks and rolls of active life within her. "My dearest child," she wrote, "if you are reading this, it means something has gone wrong. It means I did not come back from trying to save your father. I want you to know that every choice I made was out of love for you and for him. I want you to grow up knowing that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Your father is the gentlest, strongest man I have ever known. The world judged him for his size and his heritage, but I saw his heart. I saw the way he carved beauty from wood and spoke softly to frightened animals. I saw the man who would do anything to protect his family. If I do not return, know that your mother loved you with her whole heart. Know that she believed some things are worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. Justice, truth, family. These are not just words, my darling. They are the pillars on which good lives are built. Be brave, little one. Be kind. Be strong. And never let anyone make you feel small just because you are different." She signed it, sealed it, and left it with Reverend Bradford, with instructions to give it to her child if anything happened to her. Outside, the winter stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant, and indifferent to human struggles. But inside that small boarding house room, a 43-year-old schoolteacher prepared to face the greatest challenge of her life, armed with nothing but her wits, her courage, and her unshakable determination to protect the people she loved. The battle lines had been drawn. The players were in position. And come Friday afternoon, Eleanor Ashford Thornwood would walk into the lion's den and bet everything on her ability to outsmart one of the most powerful men in West Virginia. Friday afternoon arrived with deceptive calm. Eleanor stood across the street from the Blackwood Coal Company headquarters, her heart hammering against her ribs. The building was 3 stories of red brick, imposing and solid, a monument to wealth built on the backs of desperate families. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys across Cedar Ridge, the coal mining town that Silas Blackwood had essentially built and now controlled. Mary Chen stood beside her, a wicker basket over her arm that supposedly contained midwife supplies. In reality, it held empty satchels for whatever documents Eleanor might find. They had watched for the past hour as Blackwood's mine supervisors arrived for their weekly meeting. 12 men in work clothes filing into the building's east entrance. At precisely 2 o'clock, Blackwood himself emerged from his office on the 2nd floor, visible through the large windows. He was dressed impeccably, as always, his gray hair perfectly combed, moving with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He descended the interior stairs and disappeared into the conference room with his supervisors. "Now," Mary said quietly. Eleanor crossed the street, forcing herself to walk normally despite the trembling in her legs. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Maps of West Virginia hung on another, marked with circles and notations. Eleanor moved to the desk first, scanning the papers with practiced efficiency. Bills of sale, mining reports, correspondence about equipment and labor. Nothing incriminating on the surface. She opened the desk drawers systematically, her hands steady despite her racing pulse. The 3rd drawer held a leather-bound ledger. Eleanor opened it and felt her breath catch. Page after page of transactions, names and amounts in neat columns. She recognized several names immediately. Deputy Garrett Hayes, $500, dated 2 weeks before Cade's arrest. Judge William Cartwright, $1,000, dated last month. Sheriff Thomas Morrison, $250 monthly. It was a record of bribes, meticulously documented. Blackwood's arrogance had made him careless. He had written down everything, perhaps needing the records for his own accounting, never imagining someone would dare search his private office. Eleanor heard footsteps in the hallway and froze. The steps passed by, growing fainter. She released a breath she had not known she was holding and turned to the filing cabinets. The first cabinet held geological surveys. She found Cade's property easily, the folder thick with documentation. Estimated coal deposits, $2.3 million worth. Proposed rail line running directly through his land. Letters discussing acquisition strategy. The second cabinet was locked. Eleanor studied it for a moment, then remembered the letter opener on Blackwood's desk. The lock was simple, designed more for privacy than security. She worked the blade into the mechanism, wiggling it carefully. Something clicked, and the drawer slid open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, correspondence between Blackwood and various parties. Eleanor rifled through them quickly, pulling out anything that looked relevant. A letter to Judge Cartwright discussing the need to expedite Cade's hearing before too many questions could be asked. A telegram to the Ashford lawyers in Boston, the very one she had seen before, but now with Blackwood's response still attached. Then she found it. A letter from Blackwood to Deputy Hayes, dated 3 weeks earlier, with instructions so explicit they left no room for interpretation. Arrange for the planting of 20 red oak logs marked with federal property stamps on the Thornwood property. Timing must coincide with the half-breed's absence. Ensure witnesses can testify to discovery. Payment of $500 upon completion and arrest. It was signed in Blackwood's own hand, with his company's seal at the bottom. Eleanor felt triumph surge through her. This was it. This was the evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed. Blackwood had written his own confession.
She was carefully folding the letter when she heard voices growing louder in the hallway. Not passing by this time, coming closer. The meeting had ended early. Eleanor stuffed the letter and ledger into her satchel, her movements suddenly frantic. She moved toward the door, then heard the handle turning. There was no time to escape. She pressed herself against the wall behind the door as it swung open, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Silas Blackwood entered, still talking to someone in the hallway. "Just let me get those contracts, and I will meet you downstairs." He moved toward his desk, and Eleanor knew she had seconds before he turned and saw her. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing the danger, and Eleanor made a split-second decision. She stepped out from behind the door. "Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood spun around, his face cycling through surprise, recognition, and cold fury in rapid succession. "Mrs. Thornwood, what an unexpected visit." "Your half-breed husband will rot in prison, and your bastard child will be taken away, and there is nothing a schoolteacher can do about it." "Watch me," Eleanor said, and bolted for the door. She was slowed by her pregnancy and her injured ankle, but desperation gave her speed. Blackwood lunged for her, his hand catching her sleeve. Eleanor twisted away, fabric tearing. She made it into the hallway and ran for the stairs, Blackwood shouting behind her. "Stop her! Somebody stop that woman!" Eleanor hit the stairs and nearly fell, catching herself on the railing. Pain shot through her ankle, but she kept moving, half running, half falling down the steps. Behind her, she heard Blackwood's heavy footfalls, heard him calling for his men. She burst through the front door into the winter afternoon. Mary Chen was there with the buggy, already moving. Eleanor threw herself onto the seat, clutching the satchel to her chest like a lifeline. As she caught her breath, she opened the satchel to secure the documents. Her hands froze. Beneath the ledger and letters lay another book she had not noticed before. A leather journal with Blackwood's initials embossed in gold. She opened it with trembling fingers. The pages revealed something far worse than greed. Entry after entry detailed not just business plans, but personal hatred. "The half-breed stain must be removed from our mountains. Inferior bloodlines have no place in civilized commerce. When we control the land, we can ensure only the right kind of people prosper here." This was not merely corruption. This was racial cleansing, disguised as business. Blackwood had not just wanted Cade's land. He had wanted to erase Cade's very existence. Eleanor closed the journal, her hands shaking with rage. This evidence would prove the conspiracy went beyond money into something far more evil. "Go!" she gasped. Mary snapped the reins, and the horse leaped forward. Behind them, Blackwood emerged from the building, 4 of his men with him. They ran for horses tied nearby, mounting quickly. "They are coming after us," Mary said, her voice tight with fear. The buggy raced through Cedar Ridge's streets, wheels clattering on the frozen dirt. Eleanor looked back to see Blackwood and his men gaining, their horses faster than the buggy's single mare. "Head for the courthouse," Eleanor shouted. "Marshal Cooper is there." But the courthouse was 6 blocks away, and their pursuers were closing fast. One of Blackwood's men pulled alongside, reaching for the buggy's side. Mary swerved hard, the buggy tilting dangerously. Eleanor clung to the seat with one hand, the satchel with the other, praying they would not overturn. Then suddenly there were other riders, coming from side streets. Pete Sullivan on his old gelding, Jacob Winters and 2 of his brothers.
3 of the families who had lost land to Blackwood. They formed a barrier between the buggy and its pursuers, forcing Blackwood's men to slow or risk collision. Eleanor looked back to see the chaos, saw Pete standing in his stirrups and shouting something she could not hear. The distraction bought them precious seconds. Mary turned the corner toward the courthouse, and there on the steps stood Marshal Samuel Cooper, his hand on his pistol, his federal badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Blackwood and his men pulled up short, horses rearing. Cooper descended the courthouse steps slowly, his face carved from granite. "That is far enough, gentlemen. This is federal property, and I am a federal officer. Anyone who crosses that line is subject to arrest." Blackwood's face was purple with rage. "That woman stole documents from my private office. I demand her arrest for theft and trespassing." Cooper looked at Eleanor, who had climbed down from the buggy, still clutching the satchel. "What documents, Mrs. Thornwood?" "Evidence of bribery, conspiracy, and fraud, Marshal. Letters in Mr. Blackwood's own handwriting proving he orchestrated the false charges against my husband. A ledger documenting years of illegal payments to judges and law enforcement. Everything needed to prove systematic corruption." "Those are private business records," Blackwood snarled. "She had no right to take them." Cooper held out his hand to Eleanor. "May I see them, ma'am?" Eleanor handed over the satchel. Cooper pulled out the letter she had found, the one with explicit instructions for planting evidence on Cade's property. Eleanor sat heavily, one hand pressed to her racing heart, the other on her belly where the baby was kicking frantically. She had done it. Against all odds, she had walked into Blackwood's office and emerged with the evidence needed to save Cade. But the ordeal was not quite over. "The baby!" Eleanor gasped suddenly, feeling something wrong. "Mary, something is wrong." A sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, different from the baby's usual movements. Eleanor looked down to see blood spreading across her skirt. Too much blood. Mary's face went pale. The stress, the running, the fear. It had been too much. Eleanor felt the world tilting, felt hands catching her as she started to fall. She heard Mary shouting for a doctor, heard Cooper's urgent voice giving orders. The last thing Eleanor saw before darkness claimed her was the winter sky above Cedar Ridge, gray and distant and indifferent to human suffering. When Eleanor woke, she was in a bed in an unfamiliar room. Afternoon light slanted through lace curtains. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or how much time had passed. Then memory flooded back, and her hand flew to her belly. The baby. Where was the baby? A figure moved at her bedside. Mary Chen's weathered face swam into focus. "The baby is fine," Mary said quickly, pressing Eleanor's shoulders gently back against the pillows. "You are both fine. But it was close, Eleanor. Too close." Eleanor felt tears of relief streaming down her face. "How long have I been here?" 2 days. You are in the home of Judge Thaddeus Morgan. He and his wife insisted you stay here while you recover." "And Cade?" Mary's face broke into a smile. "They brought him from Pine Hollow yesterday. The charges have been dropped. Blackwood confessed to everything once he realized the evidence against him was overwhelming. Deputy Hayes is also in custody. Your husband is free, Eleanor. You did it." Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the news wash over her. Cade was free. Their baby was safe. Blackwood would face justice. After weeks of terror and struggle, it was finally over. But even as relief flooded through her, a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her that one threat still remained. The Ashford lawyers in Boston still believed they had rights to her child. That battle was not yet won. As if reading her thoughts, Mary handed her an envelope. "This came this morning, From Boston. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers. The letter inside was brief and to the point. Mrs. Eleanor Thornwood, it began, using her correct married name for the first time. Upon further investigation, we have confirmed that you were legally married to Cade Thornwood prior to conceiving the child in question. As such, the Ashford family withdraws all claims to custody. We apologize for any distress this matter may have caused. The letter was signed by Cornelius Ashford himself. Marshal Cooper paid them a visit, Mary explained, showed them copies of your marriage certificate, and had some strong words about attempting to steal children based on false information. Apparently the Ashfords were quite embarrassed to learn they had been used as pawns in Blackwood's scheme. Eleanor felt the last knot of tension in her chest finally release. It was truly over, all of it. Cade was free, the baby was safe, their enemies were defeated. Against impossible odds, they had won. There was a soft knock at the door. Mary opened it, and Cade stepped into the room. He looked thinner after his weeks in jail, his beard grown wild, but his dark eyes were bright with emotion. He crossed to the bed in 3 long strides and sank to his knees beside it. "Eleanor," he breathed, his large hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "They told me what you did, how you risked yourself and our child to save me." "What else could I do?" Eleanor said, covering his hands with hers. "You are my husband, my family."
"I would risk anything for you." Cade leaned his forehead against hers, and Eleanor felt the tremor running through his massive frame. "I thought I had lost you both. When they told me you had collapsed, that there was blood, I thought I would go mad in that cell. But we are here. We are safe, and you are free. Because of you. Because you refused to give up or back down. Because you are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known." He kissed her then, softly at first, then with growing passion, all the fear and love and relief pouring between them. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying. "I love you," Cade said, the words raw and honest. "Not because you are my wife or the mother of my child, though I treasure both of those things. I love you because you saw me, really saw me, when no one else ever had. You taught me that I was worthy of being fought for." "And I love you," Eleanor replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You taught me that love is not something buried with the past, that it can grow wild and strong like these mountains, that it is worth fighting for, worth risking everything for." They sat together in the quiet room, hands linked, while outside the winter sun set over Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and crimson. They had walked through fire and emerged stronger for it. Their faith in each other had been tested and proven unbreakable. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be a trial, testimony, the slow, grinding wheels of justice. But they would face it together, as they had faced everything else, not as victim and savior, but as partners, as equals, as two people who had found in each other something rare and precious, worth defending against all threats. And in Eleanor's womb, their daughter continued to grow, strong and vital, the living symbol of their love and their courage, and their refusal to let corruption and greed destroy the family they had built. The federal courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never hosted such a crowded hearing. Word had spread throughout West Virginia about the trial of Silas Blackwood, and farmers and miners traveled for days to witness what many saw as a test of whether honest citizens could still find justice in a system increasingly controlled by corporate interests. Eleanor sat in the front row,
7 months pregnant now, her daughter active and strong within her. Beside her sat Cade, free for 3 weeks now, but still adjusting to the reality that his ordeal was truly over. His large hand engulfed hers, a connection that had become as natural as breathing. Judge Thaddeus Morgan presided, a stern man of 62, who had built a reputation throughout the territory as incorruptible. He surveyed the packed courtroom with sharp eyes that missed nothing, then brought his gavel down once. "This court will come to order.
We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Silas Blackwood on charges of bribery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. We will also address the matter of Cade Thornwood, who was falsely accused as part of this conspiracy." The prosecution presented their case first, and it was devastating. Marshal Samuel Cooper took the stand and methodically laid out the pattern of corruption. 6 families in 3 years, all targeted after geological surveys revealed valuable coal deposits on their properties, all arrested on false charges, all losing their land to Blackwood Coal Company within months. Then came the physical evidence. The ledger Eleanor had taken from Blackwood's office, showing years of bribes paid to judges, sheriffs, and deputies. Each entry was read aloud to the courtroom. Judge William Cartwright, $1,000. Deputy Garrett Hayes, $500. The list went on, a catalog of purchased loyalty. But it was the letter that sealed Blackwood's fate. Cooper read it aloud, every damning word. "Arrange for the planting of 20 red oak logs, marked with federal property stamps, on the Thornwood property. Ensure witnesses can testify to discovery. Payment of $500 upon completion and arrest." The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Judge Morgan gavelled for silence. Blackwood's lawyers, expensive men from Charleston, tried to argue that the documents had been obtained illegally, that Eleanor's actions constituted theft, and therefore the evidence should be inadmissible. But Cooper was prepared for that argument. Mrs. Thornwood was acting as a civilian investigator, assisting a federal officer in an ongoing corruption investigation, he stated firmly. The evidence she obtained is admissible under Federal Statute 23-41, which allows for citizen participation in uncovering crimes against the public good. More importantly, Blackwood himself had confessed, under questioning immediately after his arrest. His lawyers could argue about the admissibility of documents all they wanted, but the man's own words had already condemned him. Then Jacob Winters took the stand. The lumberjack looked smaller somehow, diminished by guilt and the weight of what he had done. He spoke in a quiet voice, but every word carried clearly in the silent courtroom. "I was paid $100 by Deputy Hayes to move stolen timber onto Cade Thornwood's property. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway because my family was starving. I have 6 children to feed and my brother's widow to support. But that does not excuse what I did. I helped destroy an innocent man's life for money." Jacob's voice broke. "I am sorry. I know those words are not enough, but they are all I have. Cade Thornwood is a better man than I will ever be. He deserves justice." The defense attorney tried to discredit Jacob, painting him as a paid liar, but the evidence backed up every word of his testimony. Bank records showed the deposit of $100 into Jacob's account the day after the timber was moved. Hayes's own ledger showed the payment made to Jacob, right alongside dozens of other transactions. When Eleanor was called to testify, she walked to the stand with her hand protectively over her swollen belly. She wore a simple blue dress that Martha Collins had sewn for her, practical and modest. Her graying hair was pulled back in her customary bun. She looked like what she was, a respectable schoolteacher and expectant mother.
But when she began to speak, the steel in her voice made it clear she was also a woman who had faced down corruption and won. She described her investigation methodically, presenting each piece of evidence like a teacher walking students through a complex problem.
She explained the pattern she had discovered, the connection between geological surveys and false arrests. She detailed her interview with Jacob Winters and her research into land records. Then she described the day she had gone to Blackwood's office. "I knew it was dangerous," she said calmly. "I knew I might be caught. But my husband was facing 5 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. My unborn child would have grown up without knowing her father. I could not sit idle while that happened." The defense attorney tried to rattle her, suggesting she had fabricated evidence, but Eleanor responded to each accusation with calm logic and documented facts. She had spent 15 years teaching children how to think clearly and argue effectively. A hostile lawyer was nothing compared to a classroom of skeptical 12-year-olds. When she mentioned the letter from the Ashford lawyers, explaining how Blackwood had deliberately fed them false information to create a second front of harassment, the courtroom erupted again. Even Blackwood's expensive attorneys seemed taken aback by the depth of their client's conspiracy. Then came the moment that transformed the hearing from a simple corruption case into something larger. Reverend Thomas Bradford stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Morgan looked surprised, but nodded. "You may approach." The elderly minister walked to the front of the courtroom, his weathered Bible clutched in one hand. He turned to face not the judge, but the assembled crowd. "I have been the minister of Pine Hollow for 37 years. I have married couples, buried children, and counseled families through every kind of hardship. I thought I knew what evil looked like, but I did not truly understand it until I watched Silas Blackwood systematically destroy good people for profit." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Cade Thornwood is a man of Cherokee and European blood. Some see that as shameful. I see it as a gift from God, the joining of two peoples into something stronger than either alone. He has lived his life with more honor and dignity than most of us ever will. And this man," he pointed at Blackwood, "tried to destroy him because money mattered more than justice." One by one, others stood. Mary Chen, speaking in careful English about how Blackwood had stolen her family's land. The Morrison family, the O'Briens, the Washingtons, each telling their story of false accusations and lost homes. Pete Sullivan spoke of watching Cade grow up fatherless, how the boy had carved toys for other children even as those same children mocked him. Finally, Cade himself was called to testify. He stood at the witness stand, his 8-foot frame making even the elevated platform seem small. He wore his best suit, the same one he had married Eleanor in, and his long black hair was neatly tied back. When he spoke, his deep voice carried easily through the room. The defense attorney asked him to describe his relationship with the land Blackwood had wanted. "My mother is buried there," Cade said simply, "on a hill overlooking the valley. Every morning I watch the sun rise over her grave and remember the lessons she taught me. That land is not just property to me. It is home. It is memory. It is everything my mother worked for and died protecting." He looked directly at Blackwood. "You saw numbers on a map, dollars in coal deposits. I see the place where my mother sang Cherokee songs and taught me to carve wood. You cannot put a price on that, no matter how many millions you think are buried there." The courtroom was absolutely silent. "Do you hate Mr. Blackwood for what he did to you?" the attorney asked.
Cade was quiet for a long moment. No, I pity him. A man who would destroy families for money is already destroyed inside. He has made himself into the kind of person who cannot see value in anything that cannot be counted or spent. That is a poverty worse than anything I have ever experienced. Even Blackwood seemed shaken by those words. Judge Morgan called for closing arguments. The prosecution's case was straightforward, the evidence overwhelming. The defense tried to argue about technicalities and procedural issues, but their heart was not in it. They knew they had lost. The judge retired to his chambers for less than an hour. When he returned, his face was grim. I have reviewed all evidence and testimony presented in this case. The pattern of corruption is clear, documented, and admitted by the defendant himself. Silas Blackwood, you stand convicted of bribery of public officials, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their property through illegal means. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. You are sentenced to 20 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Additionally, Blackwood Coal Company is hereby barred from operating in West Virginia. All properties acquired through illegal means in the past 5 years are to be returned to their original owners or their heirs. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Judge Morgan gavelled for order, but did not seem displeased by the reaction. Furthermore, all charges against Cade Thornwood are dismissed with prejudice. The court formally apologizes for the injustice done to him and his family. Mr. Thornwood, you are free, and your name is clear.
Judge Morgan turned to another figure in the courtroom.
As for Jacob Winters, this court recognizes that you came forward voluntarily to testify against powerful interests, despite threats to your family. Your cooperation was essential to justice. You will serve 6 months of supervised community service, but no prison time. Use this second chance wisely. Jacob's shoulders sagged with relief. Tears streamed down his weathered face. He looked at Cade across the courtroom, his eyes begging forgiveness. Cade met his gaze and nodded once, slowly. It was not absolution, but it was understanding. Both men knew what it was to be desperate, to make hard choices, and to seek redemption. Cade stood, and Eleanor stood with him, her hand in his. Around them, people were crying, laughing, embracing. Justice had been served, not just for Cade and Eleanor, but for every family Blackwood had destroyed. As they left the courthouse, walking into the winter sunshine, Eleanor felt the baby kick hard, as if celebrating. She looked up at Cade and saw tears streaming down his face. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "I am better than all right. For the first time in my life, I feel like I belong, like I matter. Not because of what I can lift or how tall I stand, but because of who I am. You gave me that, Eleanor. You and this community that fought beside us. You always mattered, Cade. You just needed the world to catch up to what I already knew." 2 months later, on a cold March morning, Eleanor went into labor. It was not the dramatic emergency birth she had feared after her collapse in Cedar Ridge. Instead, it was steady and natural, her body doing what it had been designed to do despite her age. Mary Chen attended her, along with a young doctor from Cedar Ridge who had experience with difficult births. Cade paced outside the bedroom for 8 hours, carving anxiety into a piece of wood that would eventually become a cradle. When the cry finally came, sharp and angry and alive, Cade burst through the door. Eleanor lay exhausted against the pillows, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her face glowing with triumph. In her arms was a tiny baby girl, wrinkled and red and perfect. "Meet your daughter," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "Meet Ruby Thornwood, named for your mother." Cade approached slowly, almost reverently, as if afraid his size might somehow damage the precious bundle. Eleanor placed the baby in his enormous hands, and Ruby looked impossibly small against his broad palms. She had a shock of dark hair and bright eyes that seemed to focus on her father's face with surprising intensity. "Hello, little Ruby," Cade whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I am your papa, and I promise you will never doubt that you are loved. You will never feel unwanted or like you do not belong. You will grow up knowing that your mother is the bravest woman who ever lived, and that your father would move mountains to keep you safe." The baby wrapped one tiny hand around Cade's finger, and he made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "She is so small, so perfect. How did we make something so perfect, Eleanor?" "With love," Eleanor said softly. "We made her with love." In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm at the Thornwood cabin. Cade expanded the house, adding a nursery for Ruby, and a study where Eleanor could read and write. She had resigned from teaching, not because anyone asked her to, but because she wanted time with her daughter. The school board had begged her to reconsider, but Eleanor was firm. She had spent 15 years nurturing other people's children. Now it was time to nurture her own. Ruby proved to be a strong baby, despite her dramatic entrance into the world. She grew quickly, reaching for her father's beard, laughing at the carved animals he made for her. By 6 months, she was crawling. By 9 months, she was pulling herself up on furniture. By her first birthday, she was taking wobbly steps while Cade hovered nervously behind her, ready to catch her if she fell. The community of Pine Hollow had changed too. Cade was no longer the mountain ghost to be feared and avoided. He was the man who had been wronged and vindicated, the husband of the brave schoolteacher who had taken down Silas Blackwood. People nodded respectfully when he came to town. Children no longer whispered and pointed. Some even asked if he would teach them to carve wood like he did. The families whose land had been returned by court order formed a cooperative to resist future corporate pressure. They elected Cade to represent them on the newly formed Appalachian Land Council, an organization dedicated to protecting mountain families from exploitation. It meant travel and meetings, responsibilities Cade had never imagined having. But he accepted, knowing that his fight had been about more than just saving his own land. It had been about protecting everyone. On a warm evening in late summer, 1886, Eleanor and Cade sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Ruby played at their feet, babbling to a wooden bear her father had carved. Eleanor was pregnant again, 3 months along, and this time the pregnancy felt different. Not born of accident or desperation, but of choice and love. "Do you remember that night in the storm?" Eleanor asked, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly. "When you found me in the snow? I remember thinking you were going to die, that I had to save you. You did save me, but not the way you thought. You saved me from a half-life, Cade, from going through the motions without really living. You gave me purpose and passion and a reason to fight." Cade reached over and took her hand, his massive fingers intertwining with her slender ones. "And you gave me something I had never had, a family, a place to belong, the knowledge that I am more than what people see when they look at me." Ruby toddled over, holding up her bear. "Papa! Mama!" Eleanor scooped her daughter into her lap, and Cade wrapped his arms around both of them. They sat that way as the sun sank behind the mountains, three people who had found each other against all odds and built something worth defending. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of Pine Hollow. Lamps were being lit in windows as families gathered for evening meals. The mountains stood eternal and patient, witnesses to human struggles and triumphs. 2 years would pass, and Ruby Thornwood would grow from a tiny infant into a strong toddler with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determination. She would take her first steps, holding Cade's massive hands, would speak her first words in a mixture of English and the Cherokee phrases Cade taught her. Eleanor would have their second child, a son they named William after her late husband, a gesture of peace with the past. The cabin would ring with children's laughter, with the sound of Cade's carving knife and Eleanor's voice reading stories. Cade and Eleanor would watch their children grow, their love deepening with each passing season. They would sit on their porch as the sun set over the mountains, Ruby playing at their feet, while baby William slept in Eleanor's arms. And sometimes, in the quiet evenings, Eleanor would take out the wooden bear Cade had carved for her that first night, already worn smooth from her constant handling. She would hold it and remember the storm that had brought them together, the battles they had fought, the life they had built. She would remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That love is not something buried with the past, but something that grows wild and strong, like the mountains themselves. And that justice, while slow and hard won, is worth fighting for with everything you have. The Thornwood family became a legend in those mountains, a story told around fires and passed down through generations, not because they were perfect or powerful, but because they proved that ordinary people, armed with courage and love and unshakable determination, could stand against corruption and win. And in that cabin on the mountain, where Ruby Thornwood had first learned to carve wood and Eleanor had first learned to fight, their legacy lived on. A reminder that the smallest voice raised in defense of truth can echo through the mountains forever, inspiring others to stand up and speak out and refuse to let fear silence what is right. The mountains remember everything, and they would remember the gentle giant and the school teacher who refused to let the world break them, and the family they built on love and justice and hope that could not be bought or sold or stolen away. Their story had ended, but their legacy had just begun.